Are aware, the government are discussing today what they are going to do with this absolutely enormous budget surplus that is being projected for this year. 10 billion this year, another 16 billion next year, about 60 billion over the coming years. So the government is absolutely swimming in money, but at the same time we have an absolutely diabolical housing and homelessness crisis with record and growing numbers of families, individuals, children, pensioners who are facing homelessness, are actually homeless, and who are suffering extreme trauma and hardship as a result of the lack of the basic thing, which is a roof over their head. So we have a very simple proposal to the government, and we've made it already, and we'll make it again this week, that the enormous budget surplus they have, a very significant portion of that should be used to provide, in the first instance, a massive expansion of decent emergency accommodation for people who are being told at the moment that they should sleep in cars or that there's nowhere at all for them. That we need to expand the provision of decent quality emergency accommodation, but beyond that, and most importantly, that we need to dramatically increase the investment in refurbishing vacant and derelict properties and in building new public and affordable housing in order to deal with the housing crisis. The idea that the government would consider putting billions of euros into a savings bank, into a piggy bank, when there are children who have nowhere to sleep, who are sleeping in cars, are being sent to hostels miles and miles away from where they go to school, where they're being traumatised by the fact that they and their families are being made homeless. It just makes no sense. So we need the government to immediately make more money available to local authorities to provide emergency accommodation in their locality where people are being made homeless, so that children aren't having to travel miles and miles to get to school. But beyond that, we need a huge increase in the government investment to provide money to local authorities to refurbish vacant and derelict property, and to dramatically increase the investment in constructing new public and affordable housing. So that is our very, very strong message, because the situation of child homelessness in particular is just getting excruciating now. We are doing immense damage to children and to families when we have the resources that could actually provide for them. So we think it would be obscene for the government to put that money away in a savings bank rather than use that money now to alleviate the suffering and hardship that children and homeless families and those affected by the housing crisis are suffering.
So I'm going into Crewe after this to the Climate Committee. And so if you want to ask me any questions, if you want to, you don't have to do so as soon as I shut up. But the main point I want to make here is I just listened to the Taoiseach on the news there say that the solution to the absolutely astronomical rise in the number of households in arrears for their gas, the solution to that is that they should shop around and talk to their provider and engage with their provider. It's the same old story that he has been giving out for the last 2 years, and yes, there is a massive increase in the number of people in arrears, particularly for their gas. Electricity arrears, interestingly, are going down, but not surprising since it was subsidised by the government. But at the same time, the profits of these companies, the gas companies, are going up and up, and Crewe are going to try and explain that to us through this market mechanism of hedging, which I'm going to drill down into the detail of, because they seem to have the figures for people in arrears and for how the hedging works, but they don't have the figures for the profits that these companies are making, and I certainly have some of them. So what this indicates is, just like the grocery industry, where the Minister will sit down tomorrow for a cup of coffee with the heads of the grocery industry and have a nice chat with them. There is a political reluctance by this government to control prices while profits are going through the ceiling. And this is particularly true in energy and in food. And these are the two essentials that people are facing a day-to-day challenge with. And the government sits back and says, come in for a cup of coffee, or, oh well, go shop around. This is not the solution, and we're going to be arguing and demanding that price controls and control on the market madness has to be brought in to play in this debate. So that's me. I'm going to...
So I'm looking beyond the press pack at who's arriving through the gates of Dáil Éireann at the moment. There's some guests of mine who are going to be addressing a gathering of TDs and senators in the AV room. Now my understanding is that you guys are not allowed into the AV room, but if you want to talk to some of my guests while they're here today, I'll be happy to introduce you. So essentially what it's about is, at the start of this year, 1,000 nurses from India arrived in this country as part of the terms of a deal, a work permit deal that was hammered out. Mary Butler, Junior Minister, would be very well aware of the details of that arrangement. And they started working in private nursing homes. I'm not certain on this, perhaps some as well as home care assistants, what used to be called home helps, but overwhelmingly as healthcare assistants in private nursing homes. There were labour shortages there, and this was seen as a way of dealing with that. Issues and problems have arisen. The terms of the agreement was that these nurses working as healthcare assistants were to receive a basic wage of €27,000 per annum. Now, the owners of the private nursing homes have the right to pay higher than that, but when 27,000 is stipulated as the basic in agreement, as you can imagine, the vast bulk are being paid 27,000 and not a penny more. The work is stressful, it's demanding, it's exhausting, it's mentally draining work. And these workers, mainly women, are doing this while the Irish state forces them, in reality, to be separate from their kids, to be away from their families, and to be away from their partners. Because, as you will know, the threshold for the visa to come to Ireland, €30,000 needs to be your minimum income per annum if you're even going to be considered. And these workers are €3,000 below it. So they're on their own doing this really valuable work for our health services, and yet they're forced to be away from their families. And I think that that's wrong. Also, they have nursing qualifications, which would be the equivalent of QQI level 8 or 9 in this country. But they're being asked to do QQI level 5 training as a healthcare assistant. And you have to buy that. You have to pay for the training. It can be up to €1,700 a year. And they're being asked to pay for it out of their own pockets. So the representatives of Migrant Nurses Ireland and the nurses who are here in person today will be saying that the threshold should be at a minimum reduced, or else their pay should be increased over the 30,000 mark, maybe make them level with healthcare assistants in the HSE, and that they shouldn't be forced to do this training. In reality, they've done it already, but if the state insists on it, that the state should pay for that. So the story today is going to be dominated by other issues. I know that, but this is an important issue. We'll be raising it in the debate about skill levels, European Union skill levels, tomorrow. And if there are any reporters present here who wish to speak to any of the people I've invited in, just maybe have a quiet word with me before I dash away at the end to see them. Okay? Thank you.
Sorry on that. Is that threshold something that requires legislation to change, or is it something that could be changed by the government in that?
My understanding is that is part of EU legislation, and therefore reducing the level to 27,000 would be very challenging. The far more easy way to do it is to say, for example, that a healthcare assistant in the HSE in the public sector has a wage of over 31,000 a year, so they will be levelled up, and therefore they would exceed the threshold. Thank you.
Okay, I just want to talk briefly about the latest developments in what is a government war on neutrality. This is a war that has been in overdrive, effectively using Putin's invasion of Ukraine as a shock doctrine to try to drive through an eradication of what is left of neutrality, pursuing the pre-existing policy of Fine Gael, for example, which had a policy document back 20 years ago called Beyond Neutrality, but now they see their opportunity. Obviously, the obstacle to this has been public opinion, which continues to very solidly support neutrality. And so the latest developments is the so-called consultative forums, which are going to take place across the country in June. This idea was first raised in the form of a citizens' assembly. When Micheál Martin was Taoiseach, he said we would consider the idea of a citizens' assembly. The government then remembered that the core part of a citizens' assembly is a random selection of citizens who would therefore likely reflect broad public support for neutrality, and then that idea was shelved, and instead we've got this idea of consultative forums based on the principles of the Citizens' Assembly, but of course without the core principle of the Citizens' Assembly, which is the presence of the citizens. And the more we hear about these consultative forums, the more clear it is that this is an absolute ready-up. It has a predetermined outcome, which is a further elimination of what is left of neutrality. Two key parts of evidence for that. One is the chairperson who was chosen by the government is a woman called Louise Richardson, who after her name has the letters DBE. DBE means that Louise Richardson is a Dame of the British Empire, and she's chairing our forums, which are going to, make recommendations in terms of neutrality and so on. Louise Richardson is also quite prolific, has been writing in print for decades in the interests of and in alliance with the aims of US imperialism and US militarism. She's on record, for example, as supporting the US invasion of Afghanistan. She's on record as supporting US attempted coups in Cuba and in Nicaragua, and US successful coup in Chile. So she is not some sort of neutral arbiter on this whatsoever. She is a committed militarist and a supporter of the aims of US imperialism. And the fact that she is chairing the consultative forums on neutrality and so on should tell us everything we need to know about that. The other evidence we have is from PQs back that Gino Kenny put in, asking about who's going to be invited to these forums and so on. And the answer back from the minister is to say that civilian and military experts and practitioners are going to be invited. In other words, people who are linked to the armaments industry, people who are involved in various militaries. No mention, of course, of any peace campaigners internationally, anti-war movements, those who stand in defence of neutrality. So it's very, very clear what is being aimed here, and we're working together with others in the Irish Neutrality League and others in the broad anti-war movement and neutrality defence movement to try and expose what is happening here and to make sure that the vision and the view of the public is brought to bear, which is for a defence of neutrality. Just on that very briefly, obviously the reports yesterday in the papers about the secret agreement going back decades and then developed between the Irish government and the British government, allowing the RAF in some circumstances at least to use Irish airspace. That's very concerning. It's very concerning what is being published. We'd call on the government to publish all of the documents related to that. The Dáil should have the right to oversee any international agreements, and on the face of it, we would certainly be opposed to some international agreement which gives preferential access and allows the RAF to fly in Irish airspace. That does not seem to be in tune with the basic idea of neutrality and non-alignment that we would like to see.